To record. Okay. It is. Oh, it's now recording. Okay, I was waiting
cool.
for something to pop up. So, yeah, I'll give you just a little bit of an intro, Matt.
Right.
For those of you who don't know, Matt is a former Vice-Auditor of the Society and a MA student of NUIG.
Graduated 3 years ago today.
Yes.
Exactly today.
Yeah, so we miss him terribly. He's back in the States, back in New Jersey.
So everything's legal in Jersey.
Yeah.
It is now.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But hopefully we can get him back one day. For my fellow master students in here with me, his thesis is actually one of the books that Stefan has set out in the master's room as the, the best kind of thesis to look at for inspiration. So,
Ours is on daytime television.
And the name of your thesis escapes me at the moment.
It is.
It's late, but...
It is. Hold the Ground and Stock the Farm, a study of landscape and memory of the land war evictions and plan of campaign in Woodford, County Galway.
Yes, that's it.
Right on my bookshelf.
Yeah,
we're professionals here.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic anyway. And so for it on an entirely different subject, he's going to talk to us today about the Battle of Monmouth, which he lives nearby. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, Matt, and let you take over.
Okay, thank you very much, Bridget. Let's hopefully I do not screw this up. But I don't think so. Okay.
It would be the first time that it happened during the Archaeology Society.
Well, this year. Okay, enough jokes. We've been joking too much. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to see you. Hopefully try to mute my own video. Let me see. Whatever. I'll just deal with looking at my own face. So the Battle of Monmouth. For those of you who do not know what the Battle of Monmouth was, it happened on June 28th in 1778. It happened in Monmouth Courthouse, which is today Freehold, New Jersey, which, a little trivia, is where Bruce Springsteen is from. Though I've never seen him there yet, but just hoping. The battle, it was technically a stalemate. Technically, nobody actually won the battle, so why is it important? And we'll go into that, of course. But it was actually a major boost of confidence for the American Army, because it was probably one of the few battles they had where they really stood up for the first time to the superior British forces. But we will go into that. So, where is New Jersey? I've had to explain that a lot to some people if they're not from the Northeast. New Jersey is in the northeastern part of the United States, as you can see right there, that red little state. It is located between Pennsylvania and New York. As a matter of fact, none other than Benjamin Franklin himself once said the state was like a barrel tapped at both ends, because Pennsylvania is on one side, and with Philadelphia, one of our major cities, and New York City, the major city of the country, the largest city in the country, is right on the other side. So we are one of the reasons why we were known as the crossroads of the Revolution. Many revolutionary battles were fought here because of the proximity between the then capital, which was Philadelphia, and one of the major cities was New York. A few little facts just to introduce the state and the former colony. It is 8,700 miles squared in area, also or 22,500 kilometers squared. A length of 170 miles or 273 kilometers. A width of 70 miles or 112 kilometers. Currently a population of 8.8 million, but it's also the fourth smallest state, and which, surprised to know, is the first state in population density, and with the 11th in total population of all 50 states. So if people ask why New Jerseyans have a chip on their shoulder, that's why. We're the Joe Pesci of the United States. Another New Jersey resident, of course. Okay. Where the battle was fought, here we can see a better view of idea where it actually is. It is in Monmouth County, the Battle of Monmouth. But it was also at the time of the town of Freehold was the Monmouth Courthouse, which still is the county seat of the county. And we can see where Freehold is. It's not far from New York and not far from Philadelphia, which we'll play into when we get into a little bit more. And today, it's two towns. Freehold and Manalapan Township is where the site is, the Monmouth Battlefield State Park. So what led to the Battle of Monmouth? How did we get there? Well, it starts off after, let's start with the man himself. George Washington, he made the commander-in-chief of the Continental Forces. After getting the British to abandon Boston in New England, Washington set up in New York City. New York City was, while not the most populated city in the colonies, it was one of the most important. It was a major site for trade. Even then, there was stock markets there. It was an important. Its location was very important, being in sort of the middle part of the northern colonies. However, while setting up on Long Island and New York City, the British were too much for Washington. And most of these troops were just militia. These were untrained. They were farmers. They were just any tradespeople. Even most of Washington's officers, Henry Knox, who was the general of the artillery, was a bookseller from Boston. Men like Alexander Hamilton was just a law student at the time, who became. Oh, we'll go into him in a little bit, won't we? But most of his army was untrained. They were not used to the professional army that the British would have had. And they were really barely able to escape Manhattan Island. They evacuated Brooklyn and Long Island. They escaped up Manhattan, and they escaped up to New York, and then crossed over the Hudson River into New Jersey. And that's where they would set up winter camp. They were being chased across the entire state and would actually cross the Delaware River and set up winter camp in Pennsylvania. This then leads to probably one of the most iconic images in American history, although it's very, romanticized image of Washington crossing the Delaware. And it was a Christmas night of 1776. There's a surprise attack in Trenton, New Jersey. The Hessian were mercenaries from the German state of Hesse. Not surprised that the British monarchy would call upon other German peoples to help them out. Princeton and the battles of Trenton and Princeton were huge confidence boosters for the Americans. They had just been throttled in New York and chased across the state, and then this was major victories for them. Although while they weren't as impressive as they were surprise attacks, but they were definitely very important to show that there was some chance. However, we then lead to later in the year in 1777, we get General William Howe, who's the commander-in-chief of the British forces, leads an attack on Philadelphia, onto the capital of the fledgling colonies. However, Washington was badly defeated at the battles of Brandywine and Germantown, which led to the capture of the capital. The interesting thing was that the British weren't sure what to do, because to them it was normal at the time that capturing an enemy capital ended the war. But they were not fighting regular army. They did not know. They weren't even sure what was going to be happening, but it turns out they did fight on. And then this would then lead to the terrible winter at Valley Forge. I mean, it cannot be probably the lowest time in the Continental Army's history. Washington at the time was, after the capital being lost, there were conspiracies, not so much, the secret kind, but there was talk of having him being replaced. The previous year he had lost one of his second in command, General Charles Lee, who we'll get into, had been captured by the British, and really had no other, really, the army was, like I said, farmers. These were not trained professional soldiers. Then leads us then to Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben, or Baron von Steuben, as he is known in the United States. He was a Prussian officer from in the Prussian army, who had come over to the United States, which was common at the time. A lot of generals would sell their commissions to other countries, and became Washington's Inspector General. Now, this man basically turned basically a drill sergeant. He trained the army with his. He wrote everything down, and it became the regulations for the order and discipline of the troops of the United States, which was the official military guide of the United States from 1778 until 1812. And actually, parts of the guide are still used by the U.S. Army today mainly for drills and presentations and things like that. But it cannot be stated that during that winter, that Baron von Steuben really transformed from what was then militia and farmers into an actual fighting army. Well, eventually, during the spring of 1778, the Americans formed an alliance with France. Not surprised. France was the historical enemy of the British at the time. And with knowing this, now the Americans had a formidable navy that could come to their aid. Now, William Howe had been replaced as the commander-in-chief by General Henry Clinton, and Clinton had been ordered to evacuate Philadelphia. He was going to be splitting his troops. Most of them were going down to the Caribbean to protect British possessions from the French, and the rest would be stationed in New York City. After the British captured New York City, they held that New York City for the rest until the end of the war in 1781 and 1783 when the treaty was signed. They never left New York. They had complete control of New York City and most of Staten Island and most of the other parts of New York, but never New Jersey. That was a bit of a civil war we had going on here. So now, with Clinton, he actually, against orders, allowed for loyalist citizens to accompany the troops. This was not common at the time. They could have left them to their own devices, and in some cases they would have. But these were the people who were still loyal to the crown, and they were going to be evacuated along with everybody else. That picture in the middle there, it was basically just, there was 20,000 people evacuating. And the thing is, you see on the right-hand side there, that's a modern-day fire road in the Pine Barrens in New Jersey, but that's very common to what the roads would have been like at the time. While New Jersey now is, it's known for its highways and roads, back then they would have been very simple roads. Most of the roads, even today now, are still not in the best condition, depending on where you go. But the thing is that you have to move 20,000 people on horses, on carriages, on foot. Not to mention even the army they have to go on some of these very dangerous roads, and the trip would be very dangerous. The roads were bad. You had enemy militia who would be hiding out in the woods, either destroying wells, just tearing up roads. That wasn't that much of a problem, but the bigger problem, of course, was the natural dangers, like I said, mosquitoes, and then they're evacuating in June. Mosquitoes, which can carry the yellow fever and malaria, which were common at the time, as well as deer ticks, which carry Lyme, very small, tiny ticks, usually about the size of a pinhead, and carry Lyme disease. And these, very common even today. The Lyme disease in this area is very, very dangerous. So now, when you have civilians, not to mention soldiers wearing wool uniforms, having to march in the oppressive heat that cannot be undersold. It would have been, and here we're going to go now. This is the evacuation route they would have taken, as well as where the battles were fought. They really did have to. They had to cross the Delaware River, cross very slightly into the Pine Barrens, not too much, thank goodness for them. but still the roads, everything would have been very, very treacherous, even today. But and during this time, the plan was to reach Sandy Hook, and up there in the northwest corner there, a peninsula that's still there today, and they would have been able to board boats and evacuate to New York City. Now, while they're doing this, now I mentioned the heat, it would have been 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius in the shade. More in the direct sun would have been close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius in direct sun. And not to mention, that's also happening while the battles are taking place. These were not good times to be evacuating a major city and having to cross essentially enemy territory. Now, for the battle itself, oh geez, I messed that up. Washington had just gotten back his second in command, General Charles Lee. I have a few things to say about General Charles Lee, and I'm in a good way. If any of you have seen the play Hamilton, which anybody who's interested in any kind of historical things, I do suggest you do. It does have its, artistic license. That's to be expected, of course. But as a former band geek, I enjoyed it quite a bit. Charles Lee gets done a little dirty in there, including the line, "I'm a general, we," which I get, it rhymes, but General Lee was actually probably Washington's most competent military officer. He actually was the only professional soldier that Washington had on his staff. He was an Englishman and served as an officer in both the British and the Polish armies, and had served in North America during the 7 Years' War. He had moved here while serving in the 7 Years' War, came over and became sympathetic to the Americans and a lot of their plights, and would move to actually what is today now parts of West Virginia, which would have been part of Virginia at the time. He was actually very close to be, had he not been foreign born, probably would have been the commander-in-chief of the army, but they picked Washington, who had more experience on American soil. But he became Washington knew that he would be an excellent military man, so it made him his second in command. He knew it was good to have that advice. Unfortunately, his advice didn't help that much because he was captured during the escapes from Manhattan Island, and had recently in the early spring of 1778 had been paroled by the British Army. They had paroled him, and he was allowed to come back. So much of all that time in Valley Forge, a lot of the time with von Steuben training the army, and all the changes that Washington had begun to make, that he was completely unaware of. He had no idea that was happening. So when the battle was starting to take place, Washington had wanted Lee to lead it. It would make sense. He was the second in command. He was one of the most experienced military officers. So, of course. But Lee was a bit of a vain man. He was known for having a pack of small dogs with him at all times. Decided that was not worthy of a man of his command. So Washington decided to go with Lafayette. Well, Lafayette did lead a small force, which had led to a skirmish at Robin's Tavern. It didn't end well, and Lafayette brought his soldiers back. So after that, Lee was like, "Okay, I'll take care of this." Unfortunately, Lee didn't really want to. He just felt that, this is going to be important now. I kind of taking a little bit of the glory for himself. But all in all, I mean, to say that, to go on a little bit of a rant, Hamilton was a little bit off. I know, like I said, Lin-Manuel Miranda, I mean, it's a story about one person's life and in 2.5 hours. So there's going to be things, and it's not that as important to the plot, but it does kind of lead to how entertainment and history, while they're good to be together sometimes, got to be careful with where you get it from. Now, with Lee in charge now, Lee, because he really didn't want this, Early in the morning, they leave Englishtown, which is where the American camp was, 6 miles to the west of Monmouth Courthouse. The British rear guard had still been there and were just kind of just holding up because they knew, Clinton knew that Washington was going to try to take advantage at some point. He didn't know where. And it just it felt that this was probably the best spot for the Americans, which it kind of was. With the rear guard there, the main body had already left. So Lee began to attack, hoping the element of surprise would be to his advantage. Unfortunately, while setting up his battle plan, things change. And he neglected to tell his subordinate generals that, there's going to be changes in plans. He really felt that this was going to be probably easy. He didn't think anything of it and figured they knew what to do because this is his first battle back. And they had been with Washington the entire time. Unfortunately, that was not the case because as soon as Clinton heard that his rear guard was being attacked, he sent the main body of forces back. I mean, the confusion actually led to Lee retreating. Now, once Lee retreated, he met up with Washington, and Washington was so mad with him. I have a few bits of history here because he was so mad apparently that he swore, which is something he never did. As one of his former generals, I think General Scott, I believe, would be called later. Yes, sir, he swore on that day till the leaves shook on the trees. It was charming, delightful. Never have I enjoyed such swearing before or since. Sir, on that ever memorable day, he swore like an angel from heaven. Apparently, no one's really sure what he said, but Ron Chernow, who wrote a biography about Washington and also wrote the Hamilton biography, has him, one of the things saying is, "You damned poltroon, you never tried them." Although whether or not much of history is kind of lost. Although Lafayette did say it was the only time he heard Washington swear, and Lee recalled much later that, "I confess I was disconcerted, astonished, and confounded by the words and the manner in which His Excellency accosted me." So this was definitely he was mad. So after giving Lee the chewing out that he definitely deserved, Washington then regrouped. He had Lee move up to the front again with Anthony Wayne, who was one of his generals, and basically to buy them time to set up on Perrine's Hill, which is, if you look on our map to the upper left-hand corner there, which is where most of the battle took place. This is where the heart of the battle was. He set up his artillery and he set up his infantry in front. And at the time, the 3rd Brigade and also the 42nd Highlander Regiment would take cover in an orchard that is no longer there, but it today is part of fields where they even today on the battlefield they grow crops, different crops every year. So what they began to do was start a cannonade. This is archaeological from the Bravo group, which a battlefield archaeology group that unfortunately will be shutting down very soon. To the right there is where the orchard was. Now, that is where the British were, and the cannons were to the left. There were more cannons to the south that were the British cannons that were firing, but they up on the hill and with the advantages there of being on the hill, of course, the high ground, wasn't as effective as they would have liked. But and it's not a large hill, as we'll see very shortly. But I mean, it was an excellent position for them to hold and to keep a hold of. This is the view to the top left there from the top of the hill. It's not a large hill. It's very, walking the path up there. It's it's not very hard, but from a military point of view, it's excellent position. And now to the right is looking from the bottom. Those lines of trees, and there's a hedgerow up there now, or as much of a hedgerow as you can get in Monmouth County, New Jersey. That is what you would have been looking down from to see. And what's interesting is if you look on the bottom picture, those groups of trees in the background is Combs Hill, where today is the visitor center for Monmouth Battlefield, which would come into play later in the battle. This is what they would have been using. This is a Swedish-style 4-pounder cannon. And this is what most of the American artillery was. A lot of it was commandeered, I will say, from other forts and from anything that they can get their hands on. What they were shooting would have been canister shot up the top there, which is basically a tin can with musket balls in them of various sizes. And what they would do is they would shoot that and actually shoot it a few yards in front of the targets. And what that would do is they would explode them and would scatter all of the shot there. Because most, as I said, with most, I think, even though we all think you load a cannonball and that's what they fire, in a naval sense, yes, because you're going to be attacking a ship, you want to put holes in it, that might work. But for land artillery, that's not going to be as effective as basically what is a very large shotgun. You want to get as much spread as possible, and that is what the thing on the bottom is grape shot. Now that might be a little more fancy than probably what that would be used by the Continental Army, because in some cases it was just a sack of large metal, either mostly lead balls, and something the grape shot would have been shot basically into the troops. It was like a shotgun. I said, and that cannon there was actually a recreation. That is not one that would have been used during the war. It's actually that was made in France, I believe, and it was donated to Monmouth Battlefield by the Bravo Group and a few other Friends of Monmouth Battlefield and a few other organizations. But these cannons are basically what lead actually one of probably the most famous person to come from Monmouth Battlefield, who we'll get into and very shortly, because she's very interesting. And I said, and that was not a mispronunciation for once from me. Now, after the battle, what happened was basically the cannonade on Perrines Hill worked. He was able Washington was able to send Anthony Wayne as one of his generals into what is called the Parsonage Farm and the hedgerow area, which are still there today. It's actually a Battleview Orchards on Remrock Road, which you can go and see. And what he did was he had General Nathaniel Greene set up on Combs Hill on the bottom there, but basically having complete control of the British from an artillery perspective. Had them in a V shape and was able to just anything that they would have moved, they would have been able to protect themselves with. So this was actually one of the largest battles of the Revolutionary War when it comes to manpower. But at the end of the day, the battle basically raged till the sunset, and Washington wanted to continue the battle. He didn't want to let up. But excuse me. But with that, he once he realized he had control of the field, he was like, okay, we'll start again in the morning. But by that time, the British had actually left. They did not stick around. They knew, because at the end of the day, the whole point of the mission was to evacuate, was to get to New York City. And this for them was just a small, minor little step. And so this is what, for them, the British were like, okay, we took care of them, and now we're going to get to where we got to go. And for Washington, the most important part was that, that he stood the field. He held the field against the British for the first time ever. The British held control of the field, even though they didn't gain really any territory. This was a kind of a let's see what we can do kind of mission anyway. They were able to hold their own. And it's for the first time they had done that since the war began. Now, of course, afterwards, there's a little issue with Charles Lee. Washington was not happy. Washington was so angry that eventually, had Lee just kind of apologized and went along his way, he probably would have just nothing would have happened to him. Unfortunately, he kept saying to anybody who would listen that Washington was a mistake. It's all his fault. Everything was him. blame Washington, blame Washington. So eventually he is court-martialed very quickly afterwards, and was basically, even though some sources say that some of the charges were a little bit light, to find him innocent on any charges would have been like a vote of no confidence in Washington, and Washington just kind of delivered them this essentially a victory for them. So he was found guilty on all charges. He was, and left and kicked out of the army for so many years, although I think he eventually just resigned his commission. And of course, he still talked about Washington, which actually led to the one scene in the Hamilton musical where John Lawrence, who would actually have a duel with Charles Lee. And much like in the thing, in the musical, Charles Lee lost that duel. He didn't die, but he did get shot, basically forfeiting the duel. And he kind of disappears from history. He died very shortly after. He went to Philadelphia on business, and he got sick and died. He had caught fever, as they would have said back then. So really, much of his history is unknown. And of course, we all know what happened to George Washington. Got so famous, he got on the dollar bill. And as much as everything else, like I said, after this, though, this was one of the last major battles in the northern theater of the Revolutionary War. The next year, it was really, they started looking more towards the south. And this is only about 3 years from the Yorktown campaign, which would see Washington victorious. But that really, I said, that's the most part of the battle. This is like the quick version. There've been so many books written about this battle and the people involved. I could spend days talking to you about this. I'm giving you the quick and dirty. Here's the really important things. Here's that. But I've left out one person who is probably the most famous person to come from this battle, and it was a woman. It was most people would know her, Molly Pitcher. Many people may have heard of her. She basically, the legend goes that when her husband either passed out from heat stroke or had been shot or wounded or died, that she took up the cannon, his place in the cannon. And as we see on the left, a historical an image from the 1800s, and on the right there is the battlefield monument right in front of the modern day Monmouth courthouse. One of probably the most famous person to come from this battle is Molly Pitcher, and yes, she was real. Now, Molly Pitcher is very interesting because Molly Pitcher is not her name. That's sort of what Emily Type has kind of called. The Molly Pitcher was more of a generic term, as in what G.I. Joe would be in the World War II. It was more of a moniker that for all the women followers and the camp followers, not so much the prostitutes, which I'm sure were true, but these were like the wives of soldiers who would follow along and would help do things around the camp. A lot of times this could be cooking or cleaning, but also, like in this case, they would bring water to their soldiers. And in this heat, in the battle with the humidity probably up to 100%, and the heat being unbearable, was bringing water, and not only just for the soldiers to drink, but also to cool the cannons as well. Most people think to drink the water, but water in this time was probably not the best thing to drink. Historically, most people drank ale or ciders because it was safer to drink than just the spring water that you don't know what cow has been just in there and what diseases could be in it, bacteria and everything. So it's possible that, while it was probably to help the soldiers, but also to cool the cannons down as well. Now, there were actually a few people who kind of take the name Molly Pitcher, though the most famous, who was the woman at the Battle of Monmouth, whose name was Mary Hayes Ludwig. She was the wife of John Hayes, who served with Captain Francis Proctor's Pennsylvania Artillery Company. Now, one of the interesting is, where did Molly Pitcher get her water? And as you see on the left there, there's a little monument that was placed in the 1930s that's saying this is Molly Pitcher Spring. And if you look on our map, where that pink diamond is, right where today is the intersection near Wemrock Road and the and the Freehold, up in Freehold Road. That's where that marker is. However, Molly Pitcher would have been with the American artillery. That's where the story is, that she was working the cannon. And as you can see by that, that is not where any of the American artillery would have been. So what gives? It most likely if somebody put it there, thought, oh, this is probably where it was. It's near a spring. It's right by the road. We can bring up tourists to come to the orchard after they see this. I mean, no one really, as far as any research I tried to find, no one really knows why it was put there, but it was put there. But now, so where was Molly Pitcher? Where would she have been? Now, there was only two places where she could have been, and that's either in Perrine Hill or Combs Hill. Now, we know, well, not we, the people who have done this, the people who studied the archaeology would have known, known that because she was with her husband in Captain Francis Proctor's our Pennsylvania Artillery Co., she would have been on Perrine Hill, and she would have been on the left side, all the way by, right, if you look on our map, right by the Spotswood North Brook, that is where the cannon would have been. She would have been all the way at the edge. As a matter of fact, this is a plaque that is outside, right on Monmouth Battlefield, right near, and as it says on the bottom, you were standing at the probable location of Molly Hayes's cannon. That it would have been one of the very end of the artillery, shooting mostly at the orchard down there where the Highlanders would have been. Now, most of the images you'll actually see there is actually Molly Pitcher with the ramrod. She's the one ramming the thing down, and it's not what she would have done. Her husband was a bombardier or a cartridge runner at the very bottom of that diagram there. She was the one running from the back, because you're not going to keep any kind of explosives near the cannon, would run back, grab either the canister shot or the grape shot, run it up, and then give it to the second matros who would load the cannon. So that's what she was doing. She was running, and there is actually proof of her doing this. A young man at the time, Joseph Plum Martin, had a diary, and he wrote, and this is what he wrote about Molly Pitcher: a woman whose husband belonged to the artillery and who was then attached to a piece in the engagement, attended with her husband at the piece for the whole time. While in the act of reaching a cartridge and having one of her feet as far before the other as she could step, a cannon shot from the enemy passed directly between her legs, and without doing any other damage than carrying away all of the lower part of her petticoat. Looking at it with apparent unconcern, she observed it was lucky it did not pass a little higher, for in that case it might have carried away something else, and continued her occupation. So there's actually more than just the legend. There's actually someone who said, this is what I saw. I saw this while I was there, which is always good to have when you're studying archaeology. But so as the cartridge runner, that's what she was doing. Probably one of the more dangerous things, that she's handling these very, very dangerous objects. And as you can see here, like very up top there, and this is the kind of archaeology they would have been doing. This is some of the Bravo group. So unfortunately, they are closing down. I just recently learned that one of their people who founded them has passed away because of the COVID pandemic. And that's unfortunate, because I've seen them do demonstrations at the New Jersey History Fair last year, which was at Monmouth Battlefield, and they actually were at Combs Hill, and they were finding musket balls and grape shot. They were actually going out with metal detectors, finding it, having little kids dig it up, and they were placing it, and they were taking GPS readings and finding out every one they did. So it's pretty. I'm a little disappointed that they're not going to be doing anything anymore, because they were probably the major group doing a lot of the research at Monmouth Battlefield. So and with that, they were able to put this little bit of legend and place it into a historical, not just a historical landscape, but in the real landscape. But this is, you can go to the spot where Molly Pitcher actually was, and then you can kind of get to try to see. I always try to go to Monmouth Battlefield once or twice a year, whenever I can, and I love walking the fields. I love going through that. It's a good way to actually, and it's actually good that in this area where there's not a lot of history left, a lot of it's been paid paved over or turned into Dunkin' Donuts. So it's good to see that, you know, that there is this little piece of history that's still preserved, and that anybody can still go there when you can. So that's it, and thank you. Let me see if I can, oh, there we go.